All right, thank you for joining us for this presentation on the origin of life. My name is Chip Gilmore. I'm a board-certified naturopathic doctor. I have been a pastor of a church for 16 years, and I just want to say thank you for joining us tonight. For this presentation, I hope it's a blessing to you, and it is something that some of the truth that I'm going to be sharing with you tonight is something that I feel is very important, helpful, and things that I use in my practice. Also, want to say thank you to Angie and to Academy Epic for the opportunity to present this information. And again, hope that it is a blessing to you in your life. So we're going to be talking about the origin of life. And basically, there are two broad ideas on the origin of life: the theory of evolution, and then intelligent design or creationism. And so we're going to be looking primarily at whether or not the evidence, as we are taught in school, college, high school, the evidence for evolution is actually what people say that it is. Okay, we are not advancing. There we go. All right. So let's just make sure that, first of all, we're on the same page with the definition of evolution. So this is a definition you can look up online, American National Association of Biology Teachers. And they state that the diversity of life on Earth is the outcome of evolution, an unsupervised, impersonal, unpredictable, and natural process of temporal descent with genetic modification that is affected by natural selection, chance, historical contingencies, and changing environments. In other words, it's luck. All of life resulted purely by random processes without guidance by any outside intelligence. Or you might call it bad luck, depending on how life is going for you. Well, this is how the debate is typically framed. This is what they want you to think, is that evolution belongs to science and creation belongs to religion. And this is basically the same thing as saying one is testable, the other is not. One is true, the other is not. One is the same as the law of gravity, and the other one is the same as believing in Santa Claus. And that's how the debate is typically framed. Here's one example, and this appeared in the Courier Journal, which is the Louisville newspaper where I'm from. Susan Reigler said this: this process of organic evolution has been exhaustively documented by scientists since Darwin's time with evidence from the expanding fossil record, DNA mapping, observations in population biology, and discoveries in comparative biochemistry. Now, who could argue with that? That sounds pretty foolproof. However, what I'm going to be showing you tonight is that it may not be quite as foolproof as Susan would have you believe. But if it's not quite so foolproof, then you might ask the question, why don't we hear any dissent? Why don't you hear the opposing viewpoints when you are in college or high school? And one of the things that you can do, you can look this up. There's a movie called Expelled. You could probably find it on YouTube. One of the things you'll find is that there is tremendous peer pressure and prejudice against any professors who dare to ask critical questions of evolution. Those who suggest a different interpretation of the evidence are belittled, passed over for promotions, not given tenure. They're occasionally fired. This atmosphere on campus, again, like I mentioned, there's an entire movie that's made about the suppression of dissent. So we're not even talking about people that are Christians, but anyone who says, well, wait a minute, things aren't adding up here, is given a pretty hard way to go. Here's one example. So many of you will recognize the name Ben Carson, probably most recently from the debates, the Republican debates. He was a presidential candidate. I believe he has a cabinet position now in President Trump's administration. But Carson has directed neurosurgery at the Johns Hopkins Children's Center for more than 25 years. He overcame a hard childhood in inner city Detroit and has become particularly famous for his work in separating twins with conjoined heads. And this work was the subject of a movie entitled Gifted Hands. I highly recommend it if you get a chance to watch that. In 2008, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the US, and he has written 5 books. So, bottom line is, he's not your basic village idiot. The guy is pretty smart. Well, in May of 2012, Carson delivered the commencement address at Emory University. But rather than celebrate the brilliant career and contributions of this man, controversy erupted on campus because Carson does not embrace the molecules to man theory of evolution. 4 Emory biology professors complained to the school newspaper that Carson argues that there are no transitional fossils that provide evidence of the evolution of humans from a common ancestor with other apes, and that life is too complex to have originated by the natural process of evolution. We'll get into why Carson would say that. Maybe that sounds rather strange. But these professors, joined by 160 other faculty members, so it's a pretty good groundswell movement here, as well as many researchers and students, stated flatly that Carson is incorrect. Now notice how they frame what they say next. The theory of evolution is as strongly supported as the theory of gravity. In other words, it's science, the other is not. And the theory that infectious diseases are caused by microorganisms. Dismissing evolution disregards the importance of science and critical thinking to society. Now, who would want to do that? And so you might be thinking at this point, well, isn't it just religious people who have this dissenting opinion? Isn't it just religious people like Ben Carson? I believe he is a Seventh-day Adventist, and he's religious, so that probably clouds his viewpoint. Well, you would be wrong. There are actually plenty of agnostics and even atheists who are basically calling into question the theory of evolution. And here's one example. Michael Denton, an Australian biologist and medical doctor, and self-described agnostic, has also challenged the Darwinian faith in his book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, in which he shows that evolution's intellectual foundation has steadily been eroding. And it is only the philosophical will to believe in Darwinism that keeps it afloat. New findings in biology have brought us very near to a formal, logical disproof of Darwinian claims. Denton shows that Darwin's grand claim that all life forms are interrelated and evolved from a single cell has not been supported, notice the statement, by one empirical discovery since 1859. So that's from a description of his book. And that's quite the opposite of what appeared in our local newspaper, the criticism that was presented of Ben Carson. So we have 2 very different ideas here. So here's what I want you to see tonight is that evolution is a worldview. It's not a fact, it's a philosophy. It is a faith. What I hope to demonstrate by the end of the presentation here tonight is that, in my opinion, it takes more faith to believe in evolution than it does to believe that there is a creator who has a purpose and a plan for your life. It takes more faith to believe that everything happened by random chance. So evolution is a part of a worldview called naturalism. And that worldview, before ever looking at the evidence, before they ever even begin to examine the science, naturalists begin with the assumption that God had nothing to do with it. So no matter where the evidence points, they're going to come up with a natural solution or look for a natural solution. Even if all the evidence does point to a supernatural creator, they rule that out because it's not a part of their worldview. So this is what the real debate should be: science versus science. Not science versus religion, but how do different people interpret the evidence? So let's get into this. First thing I want to say is that evolution is a theory, not a fact. It's the theory of evolution. What's a theory? A theory is a proposed explanation whose status is still conjectural. That is, it's an educated guess. In contrast to well-established propositions that are regarded as reporting matters of actual fact. So does the evidence from science point to the evolution or point to evolution for the origin of life? So you be the judge. And this is the way we should approach all different issues that come towards us, is to look at the evidence objectively, to make a decision. What do we believe about what we're being presented? So you be the judge. So tonight we're going to take a closer look at the evidence. And we're going to do that by going through the evidence presented by Jonathan Wells in one of his books. But Jonathan Wells is a man that became an atheist, but then went back and re-examined the points that caused him to become an atheist. So he grew up as a Christian, but became an atheist halfway through college, where he got his undergraduate degree from University of California, Berkeley, in geology and physics, with a minor in biology. At Yale Graduate School, he specialized in the 19th century controversy surrounding Darwin. Wells re-examined the evidence that led him to become an atheist. So here's the different points that he went through, and we're going to go through each of these tonight. Haeckel's embryos, microevolution, that is, for example, variation in dogs, common descent or similarities between animals, the Stanley Miller experiment, the Archaeopteryx fossil, and we're going to just take a broader look as well at the fossil record. What does it actually show? And then you'll remember the little posters that you see everywhere, the march of ape-like creatures evolving into humans. And then lastly, Darwin's Tree of Life, which shows the little single cell at the bottom evolving through macroevolution into the complex mammals and complex creatures that we see around the world today. So let's begin by looking at Haeckel's embryos. So these are, perhaps you remember seeing this in your biology textbooks. This is what is known as Haeckel's drawings, Haeckel's embryos. Now, what Haeckel was trying to demonstrate through these drawings was that embryos, whether you come from a turtle or a fish or a pig or a dog or a human, that in the embryonic stage, there's really very little difference between the different species. So Haeckel's point was it would take very small mutations to get from one type creature to another in these embryonic stages. Well, that may sound reasonable, but here's the problem. In an interview with journalist Lee Strobel, Wells revealed his discovery about Haeckel's embryos. They were faked. You can call them fudged, distorted, misleading, but the bottom line is that they were faked. Apparently, in some cases, Haeckel actually used the same woodcut to print embryos from different classes because he was so confident of his theory that he figured he didn't have to draw them separately. In other cases, he doctored the drawings to make them look more similar than they really are. At any rate, his drawing misrepresents the embryos. Nevertheless, you will still find Haeckel's embryos being presented in biology textbooks as proof of evolution. So another point that was talked about with Wells as he began to re-examine the evidence, that caused him to forsake his belief in a creator was microevolution. And the point here is that microevolution is being presented as evidence for macroevolution. So what do we mean by microevolution? Well, these are small changes within species, and you'll usually hear talked about the Galapagos Islands and the finches, their beaks change size, or peppered moths, or the differences between dogs and the variety of dogs that we see. There was a young man in Denver, Colorado, a high school student, that dared to speak out and question the theory of evolution. And there was a man by the name of Dr. Bruce Alberts, the president of the National Academy of Sciences, that took this young man to task in a Denver newspaper. He said, "Those interested in understanding how science works may wish to read a recent book, The Beak of the Finch, which described new studies on the Galapagos Islands that confirm and elaborate on Darwin's original work." And then he says this: "Evolution happens all around us." So what are we talking about when we talk about microevolution? Well, you can see, and it's not too difficult to look around you at the different types of dogs. So here's some different dogs that you might see or recognize, different breeds. And this represents microevolution. Now, these dogs look very different, but no one would argue that they're anything but a dog. They haven't evolved into anything but a dog. Now, if you were to see something like this, you might say, hey, we're onto something here. Now that is macroevolution. We're beginning to see a dog that, quite frankly, looks a little creepy. I'm going to move on here, but that would be more an example of macroevolution. So here's the problem with microevolution, is that it does not prove macroevolution. No one disagrees. So intelligent design people and evolutionists all agree that small changes take place within a species. But microevolution involves, and this is very important, the loss of genetic information. So if you go back in time, you will find dogs that possessed more genetic information than dogs today. And through breeding over 1,000 years, we're able to weed out genetic information so that you get these pure breeds. Microevolution involves the loss of genetic information, whereas macroevolution would require the addition of tremendous new information to go from, say, a lizard to a bird. And I wanted that to look like a finch, but I think that's probably a poppin or something like that. But so the third thing that is Wells described, is commonly used as evidence for evolution, is the idea of common descent. And by common descent, we simply mean pointing out the similarities between animals. So for example, horses, dogs, monkeys, and humans all have backbones. So therefore they must, since they have this similar structure, they must have descended from a common ancestor. Well, what's the problem with that? Problem is that it assumes a creator would have to create everything completely unique with no shared features. And it still does not explain how the differences came to be. It doesn't eliminate the possibility of common design. So when we think about transportation, what's the best way for things to move across the earth? Well, it's the wheel. And so we can look at a bicycle, and that's one mode of transportation, or a train, that's another mode of transportation, or a car. Different modes of transportation. But basically, intelligent beings decided that this design was the best means of transportation. And so different things were created using that same design. It's the same thing. It's very possible that a creator could have decided, well, a backbone is the best, or that skeleton is the best way for mammals to move across the earth. So common descent does not rule out the possibility of common design. And it's this type of reasoning that led another man. So we've talked about Dr. Wells and his, Jonathan Wells, his transformation from being an atheist to someone who believes in intelligent design. Well, here's another person. Dr. Philip Johnson, a law professor at UC Berkeley and a satisfied agnostic. He wasn't a creationist, but he changed his view and became a creationist and started what is known as the intelligent design movement. And his reasons for this change are laid out in his book, Darwin on Trial. But the bottom line is he began to look at the arguments that were being presented, and he basically describes the way these arguments are being presented as the emperor's new clothes. In other words, people are saying, it's true, it's true, it's true. But you end up walking around naked because the evidence is not actually there. In an article written about Philip Johnson and Christianity Today, Tim Stafford writes that while law, and criminal law particularly, might appear to be the very worst academic preparation for attacking evolutionary theory, in fact, it served Johnson well. Criminal lawyers consider how to present evidence and argument convincingly. Reading evolutionary theorists, Johnson thought of clever lawyers presenting a flawed case. He says something about their rhetorical style made him think they had something to hide. And in subsequent interviews, Johnson states evolutionary biologists state their assumptions as fact. They state their assumptions emphatically, then treat them as proof. And one of the first things I noticed was that some evolutionary biologists I talked to couldn't appreciate the difference between what they'd proved and what they'd only assumed. They didn't really understand the difference. Thus I wrote Darwin on Trial, which is really a critique of bad reasoning presented as legitimate science. Darwin on Trial is my book on evolutionary science. It goes into the scientific detail fairly thoroughly to show that the evidence is against the theory of evolution at every point. This leads to the conclusion that what is driving the evolutionary science community is not the evidence, but a philosophical position that they endorse in spite of the evidence. So Philip Johnson goes back to what I said here at the beginning, that evolution is not a fact, it's a worldview. It is a belief in something before the evidence is even taken into consideration. Well, there's another experiment that was used to show that life could begin from nothing. And I remember reading about this both in my high school and college biology classes. It's called the Stanley Miller experiment. And what Miller did is he conducted an experiment in which electricity was sent into a mixture of steam and hydrogen, methane, and ammonia gases. He was successful through his experiment in producing a few of the 20 amino acids found in the living things. But there are several problems with the experiment that are never reported in biology textbooks. One of the major problems for the origin of life is the presence of oxygen. Oxygen would tend to destroy the organic compounds needed for life. But if oxygen were absent, the atmosphere would lack an ozone layer to shield the compounds from ultraviolet rays. A catch-22 for evolutionists. Miller excluded oxygen from his experiment, though today the evidence points to the presence of oxygen in the atmosphere throughout Earth's history. Starting in water is also a problem since water tends to break the bonds of some amino acids, prevents them from forming chains. Miller isolated the products in order to avoid this destructive reaction. Let me break this down for you. If Miller were to use what is thought to be the Earth's actual atmosphere at the time when evolution would have taken place, life would have been destroyed before it could have even gotten started. So Miller used what would have been a very unrealistic atmosphere, one that is known to be false. Another significant problem is that Miller's experiment generated both right and left-handed amino acids. And this is a problem because the amino acids present in living things contain only left-handed amino acids. Random chemical reactions result in a mixture of both forms, a situation that is toxic to life. Bottom line, this has led many scientists to abandon Miller's theory and try to come up with alternative explanations. In the movie Expelled, for example, and this is quite humorous in my opinion, Richard Dawkins readily admits that no one knows how life began and puts forth what is known as the panspermia hypothesis as a possibility. You can actually go watch this in the movie, but Dawkins actually says it's possible that life on Earth could have been seeded by aliens. Seeded by aliens. I don't know why he has such a problem with an intelligent creator when he doesn't have a problem with life coming from aliens. And then you have the problem of where did they come from? Here's the bottom line. With the rejection of the Stanley Miller experiment, Ken Nielsen from the University of Southern California sums it up. He says, nobody understands the origin of life. If they say they do, they are probably trying to fool you. Well, that is, no naturalist understands the origin of life. Well, what about the fossil evidence? Archaeopteryx is a famous fossil that is presented in textbooks to support the idea of a missing link between dinosaurs and birds. It's the heralded link between reptiles and birds. But what you may not know is that it is surrounded by controversy, but still presented as fact. If you look up Archaeopteryx on Wikipedia, you will see that it is still presented as fact. Larry Martin, a paleontologist from the University of Kansas, said clearly in 1985 that the Archaeopteryx is not an ancestor of any modern birds. Instead, it's a member of a totally extinct group of birds. But more than that, there's even a bigger problem with Archaeopteryx. Since the early 1980s, several prominent scientists have charged that Archaeopteryx is a forgery. Honest disagreement as to whether Archaeopteryx was or was not a forgery was possible until 1986, when a definitive test was performed. An X-ray resonance spectrograph of the British Museum fossil showed that the finer grained material containing the feather impressions differed significantly from the rest of the coarser grained fossil slab. The chemistry of this paste also differed from the crystalline rock in the famous fossil quarry in Bavaria, Germany, where Archaeopteryx supposedly was found. In other words, it's a forgery. This is one of many examples. There's a video that I've seen of a man from National Geographic admitting that they knew before they printed the magazine about a particular fossil from China that that fossil was a forgery. I just want to ask you a question. Let's think about this for a second before we move on. If all this fossil evidence is out there, why are they creating forgeries? Why would they even need to? That doesn't make any sense. So what about the rest of the fossil record? We're told that it has exhaustively proven evolution, and if evolution is true, let's talk about what we should see in the fossil record. What we should see is this, if evolution is true. The presence of millions of transitional forms showing the path from the simplest cells to the most complex organisms. We should also see, there's something that got deleted there, gradualism, let's go on. Let's talk about what the fossil record actually shows. The fossil record shows stasis, which is the absence of any significant change in animals over a long period of time. It also shows sudden appearance, that is, species do not arise gradually, but appear suddenly and fully formed. Let me give you a few examples of that. One is what's called the Cambrian explosion. In this famous fossil bed, nearly all of the animal phyla appear in the rocks of this period without a trace of the evolutionary ancestors that Darwinists expect to find. They appear suddenly and fully formed. Richard Dawkins, previously mentioned, author of The Blind Watchmaker, says of the Cambrian explosion, it's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Regarding the fossil record, Harvard professor Stephen Jay Gould says this: after 120 years of fossil research after Darwin, it has become abundantly clear that the fossil record will not confirm this part of Darwin's process. Another Harvard professor, Niles Eldredge, says, we paleontologists have said that the history of life supports the story of gradual adaptive change, i.e. evolution, all the while really knowing that it does not. We're saying one thing, but knowing that the truth is actually something very different. So these two men trying to explain the fossil record came up with a theory to explain the absence of the transitional forms that they expected to find in the fossil record. So Gould and Eldredge proposed a new theory they call punctuated equilibrium. Now, why did they come up with this theory? To deal with an embarrassing fact, that the fossil record today, on the whole, looks very much as it did in 1859, despite the fact that an enormous amount of fossil hunting has gone on in the intervening years. So if, as we are taught in high school, in college, through the textbooks, that the fossil record has exhaustively proven evolution, why do you have to come up with a theory to explain missing fossils that should be there? That doesn't make any sense. I want to give you one last example, and I'm going to show you a short video here in just a second. But one of the things, if you go to museums of science, look at the textbooks, you'll find museum diagrams that show fossils of a land mammal with a fluke tail, the kind of tail that is found on a whale. So basically, they believe that whales, being mammals, climbed out of the water, and you had these land mammals that had the same type of tail, and they called this fossil Rhodocetus. But there's just one problem with Rhodocetus. And I'm going to show this little video. This is the man that you're looking at right here, is the actual creator of this theory about Rhodocetus. So I'm going to show you this quick video. Hopefully this comes through okay.
When this video series was being filmed on location at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, the executive producer noticed a discrepancy between museum drawings of Rhodocetus and the fossils. The reconstruction of Rhodocetus had a whale fluke, but there were no fossils of the tail to confirm this. Dr. Phil Gingrich, the scientist responsible for the discovery and reconstruction of Rhodocetus, was questioned how he knew there was a whale fluke on Rhodocetus, since that part of the fossil was missing.
What was the reasoning that the scientists think there was a fluke on Rhodocetus based on the other pieces of anatomy?
Well, I told you we don't have the tail in Rhodocetus, so we don't know for sure whether it had a ball vertebra.
Reloading. Just getting
indicating a fluke or not. So I speculated it might have had a fluke.
Scientist Gingrich also acknowledged that the flippers were drawn on the diagram without these fossils. Now, he does not believe this animal had flippers. Again, his answer was surprising, since the museum diagrams had flippers on Rhodocetus.
I'm going to go ahead and just move on. I mean, that really is a very interesting video, but the bottom line is the man that's responsible for the discovery of that fossil admits we speculated that this land mammal had a whale tail. And they're presenting that in museum diagrams as though it were a fact, as though they know. And now he's actually refuted his own initial theory, and he doesn't believe that it does have that, but it's still being presented in the museums. All right, the sixth thing, and again, this goes back to Jonathan Wells, things that are normally presented as evidence for evolution, what caused him to lose his faith in creation. The March of Apes. So you've probably seen some picture like this, and this stuff is presented all the time. We're inundated with it. With my kids, I've watched the cartoon movie Ice Age, which produces one of these things for Sid the Sloth, a similar type march like this of evolution. But the problem with that poster is that the missing links are still just that. They're missing. And here's some of the mistakes and false evidence that's being used still, even though we know it's a hoax, sometimes you'll still see it presented as fact. One of these is Piltdown Man. It's now been proven to be a hoax. But Piltdown Man was used to establish the journey from an ape to a human being. Lucy, the missing link found in Africa, after finding the rest of her skeleton, she was discovered to be an ape. So it kind of makes you wonder, these guys are so smart, how are they making mistakes like that? They find a bone from an ape, say it's a missing link between apes and human beings, and then they find the rest and say, oops, it's just an ape. And again, the Hard Facts Wall in San Francisco Museum supplies imaginary common ancestors for the animal groups, misleading visitors into thinking fossil ancestors have been found. Now, this is another one, Nebraska Man. I call this false evidence. Oops. There's my little pig mockingly going across the screen. The whole idea of Nebraska Man was concocted from a single tooth. So you're looking at the picture there of Nebraska Man from a single tooth, which, by the way, happens not to be a man's tooth. It was later discovered to be from a pig. And this is the evidence that we have for molecules to man evolution. So let me summarize the problem with what we have here with what's called macroevolution. Number one, macroevolution is nowhere observed. By definition, a scientific fact is something proven to be true through observation and experimentation. So do we observe today the millions of living transitional forms that should exist? No. In other words, if birds evolved from lizards, why don't we see the millions of little steps still alive on the earth that it took to get from a lizard to a bird? All those transitional forms died out, and you just have these two distinct species. We don't see the millions of living transitional forms that should exist. Do we observe today the process of evolution creating new species? No, we do not. We see the opposite, extinction. There are fewer species on the earth today than when you were born. Are experiments able to recreate the process? Well, we already talked about the Stanley Miller experiment, so no, they are not. There is nothing like that. And this fact led Charles Darwin himself to ask the question why, if species have descended from other species by insensibly fine gradations, tiny little steps, why do we not everywhere see innumerable transitional forms? Why is not all of nature in confusion instead of the species being, as we see them, well defined? So you see the little picture over here with the lizard at the bottom and the bird at the top. Why don't we see those transitional forms in between? And that was a question that Darwin himself asked. Okay. So this is another video that I'm going to try to show. If it locks up, we'll just move on. But this is somebody interviewing people and asking them if they can give one example of macroevolution. That's basically what they're doing. So we're going to start this and go up to about there. I'm going to give this just a second or two to start. If it doesn't start, we're just going to move on. I normally have a good internet connection.
Ever. Could you give me an example of Darwinian evolution, not adaptation or speciation, but a change of kinds?
Well, I'm gonna move on. I'll post this video on my Facebook page if somebody wants to check it out, or maybe Dr. Angie can post that somewhere. But the bottom line is, he goes in and he interviews. He's actually on college campuses interviewing professors in the science departments, and basically the answers that they give him of examples of macroevolution are bacteria that become bacteria. Finches whose beaks change, and he says, well, what do they become? And they said, well, they're finches. So finches become finches. Bacteria becomes bacteria. The bottom line is, in their minds, they're thinking, well, this is an example of macroevolution, when actually it's just an example of what's called adaptation. That is animals not changing species, but just adapting to their environment, or certain genetic information within a species being preferred over others. So we're going to conclude with number 7 here, Darwin's Tree of Life. So down there at the bottom, you see the little tiny single cell, and then up there, at the top, we see the more intelligent life, and there's yours truly representing intelligent life at the top of the tree. So we're going to ask the question, does science provide evidence to support Darwin's Tree of Life? To consider this question, let's begin at the base of the tree with the most basic of all living creatures. We're going to consider a single cell. So surely, let's not talk about mankind or birds or the eyeball. Let's just talk about a single cell. How would that have evolved? A single cell has 239 proteins. Each protein consists of a chain of hundreds of amino acids. What are the odds of forming just one of the 239 proteins by random chance? Not the cell, but what are the odds of correctly putting the amino acids in the right order by random chance? You ready for this? 1 in 1,2,500,000 times 10 to the 321. That's 10 followed by 321 zeros. If you were putting your hope in that for winning the lottery, you'd be waiting a long time. Statisticians say that an event with a chance of 1 in 10 to the 50, not 10 to the 321, with 50 zeros behind it, will never happen. And these numbers led one evolutionist to say, it's not just unlikely that life could have emerged by chance, not just improbable that life could have emerged by chance, but it is outright impossible that life could have emerged by chance. Compounding these astronomical odds of forming a single protein is the fact that there's not the remotest reason to believe proteins could ever form a membrane-encased, self-reproducing, self-repairing, metabolizing, living cell. No scientist has ever demonstrated that this fantastic jump in complexity could have happened, even if the entire universe had been filled with proteins. British astronomer and agnostic scientist Sir Fred Hoyle puts it this way: believing that the first cell originated by chance is like believing a tornado could sweep through a junkyard filled with airplane parts and form a Boeing 747. But the problem gets even worse. Let's get down to the problem of DNA. What should we conclude from the intelligence, I can't think of another word, the information inside of DNA? DNA is a chemical language in every cell. It's an instruction manual for the development of every cell. It contains precise instructions for piecing together all of your 600 muscles, 2 million optic nerve fibers, and 100 billion nerve cells. It is the intelligence inside of DNA that caused yet another atheist to flip his position. And this one literally shocked the academic community. Anthony Flew, age 81, has been a legendary proponent, he's now passed away, and debater for atheism for decades. So he debated creationists on college campuses, arguing for evolution. But in 2004, he shocked the intellectual world when he stated that the onus of proof of God must lie upon the theist. However, in 2004, Professor Flew did the unheard of action of renouncing his atheism because, as he said, the argument to intelligent design is enormously stronger than it was when I first met it. And in a recent interview, Flew stated, "It now seems to me that the findings of more than 50 years of DNA research have provided materials for a new and enormously powerful argument to design." Flew also renounced naturalistic theories of evolution, saying, "It has become inordinately difficult even to begin to think about constructing a naturalistic theory of the evolution of that first reproducing organism." And he has come over to the intelligent design side. So let me ask you a question. In every other area of life, people conclude that intelligent life is behind this kind of information. Of satellites listening to random static from outer space since 1960, Carl Sagan says this: if they were to get just one message from space, just one, they would know for a fact that there's intelligent life out there. Why? Because random static never produces a sentence by chance. So what should we conclude from DNA? From the complexity of life. If the DNA information from one cell were translated into English, from one cell, it would fill 20 volumes of Encyclopedia Britannica. So let's finish this sentence. If one sentence from outer space is equal to intelligent life, then 20 volumes in the Encyclopedia Britannica, the information in DNA, should equal intelligent life. And I know I should stop here, but the problem with coming up with one single cell gets even worse, because DNA creates a chicken or the egg type of problem. Walter Brown describes the problem saying this: DNA cannot function without at least 75 pre-existing proteins. But proteins are produced only by DNA, because each needs the other. A satisfactory explanation for the origin of one must also explain the origin of the other. Apparently, this entire manufacturing system came into existence simultaneously. So there's a little chicken or the egg problem. The evolutionist claims that given enough time, even this extremely complex cell could be formed by random chance. This is like saying that given enough time, wind, waves, and rain could randomly arrange sand on a beach into just about any configuration and without any intelligent life behind it. So on this next slide, I'm going to show you a picture of something that was found on the beach that was formed randomly by wind, waves, and rain. It's probably the most important, intelligent, random thing that you will ever find on the beach. Here's the image. So given enough time, random, just the wind blowing formed this image. Now, obviously, you know I'm being sarcastic by saying it that way, but honestly, this is the way many scientists are beginning to look at the explanation of forming a single cell by random chance, even given all the time of eternity. It couldn't produce that any more than the wind, given enough time, could produce the sand sculpture that you're looking here at this image. So I want to wrap up this presentation by talking about just a few implications. Evolutionist William Provine of Cornell University conceded that if Darwinism is true, there are 5 inescapable implications. There's no evidence for God. There's no life after death. There's no absolute foundation for right and wrong. There's no ultimate meaning for life. And people don't really have free will. Conclusion. Evolutionists believe in evolution in spite of the evidence. I quoted George Wald early in the presentation. Here's the rest of his quote. It's not just unlikely that life could have emerged by chance, not just improbable that life could have emerged by chance, but it is outright impossible that life could have emerged by chance. And that leads us then to only one other conclusion, that of supernatural creation. But we cannot accept that on philosophical grounds. Therefore, we choose to believe the impossible, that life arose spontaneously by chance. I want to give you a few other implications. If there really isn't all this evidence for evolution, there really are no other explanations for the complexity of life that we see all around us. And if there is a creator, if there is an intelligent designer, yes, I know there's things that we can't explain, like the problem of pain and things like that, and we'll save that for another presentation. But if there is a creator, there's life after death. That means that we can have hope in this life, that there is eternity, and this life is not all that there is. There is an absolute foundation for right and wrong. And there is meaning for life. If there is a creator, then before I answer that question, I just want to say a couple of last things here. Sometimes when we look at the health of someone, we need to not just look at physical issues like diet and the need to detox. We need to look at sometimes more than emotional issues. We need to look at spiritual issues. And I will tell you that I have, in dealing with spiritual root issues, dealt with and seen people heal instantly, well, within a week's time, of things that they were told were incurable. When you deal with underlying spiritual root issues. And one of those things is, and I want to say this, you were created, you have value, you have meaning. Our Creator did not make a mistake when He made you. And it's very important for you to believe that, because it's important for you to love yourself so that you can in turn love others and love God. If there is a creator, then why doesn't He care more for His creation and show Himself? Someone like Richard Dawkins might ask. Well, the reality is that our Creator, in my understanding, has revealed Himself. And He loves you. We celebrate this at the time of Christmas. John 3:16 says, God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, that whosoever believes in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And so that concludes this presentation. This is the tip of the iceberg. There's tons more information, but I hope I've whet your appetite. Hope that you'll look up some of the resources that I discussed, some of the books like Darwin on Trial or Evolution, a Theory in Crisis, some of the videos like Expelled, that you'll look into these things for yourself, and that maybe the seed of truth has been planted in your mind that there is a creator, there is meaning, and that your life does have value. Thanks again for listening in.